Today on Independent Wrestling Profiles, we're talking with the Culture King, Sway Archer. I want to explore the story of Sway Archer's journey through wrestling. So obviously the prologue is the best place to begin. When did you first become aware of the industry or even become a fan of wrestling?
So aware of the industry is as long as I can remember. My mom has always been kind of a fan of wrestling, obviously far more in the late 90s, early 2000s. My dad has been a fan of wrestling, and he's watched here and there over the years. There's bits that he missed. I'd want to say he missed the things he missed are the same things that I missed because they weren't being played in the household. And I didn't really have my own TV in my bedroom that I could put wrestling on and watch. So he probably missed the Ruthless Aggression era for the most part, but otherwise it's been sort of a constant in my household. So from as early as I can remember, there's been wrestling on, although I was very limited in scope. So from literally one of my first formative memories, being 3 years old, seeing Raw on the TV, having, there was a Rock VHS tape that was The Rock Know Your Role or something like that. They did it for a few people. They did it for Triple H, they did it for Austin, they did it for Rock. And it was just a VHS with a bunch of their matches and a bunch of interview segments with them, and then a bunch of their important on-screen segments. I know it had the This Is Your Life thing that Mick Foley did for him, so stuff like that. I watched that tape a lot when I was a kid because it wasn't something that I was required to stay in the living room with my parents and watch. I said I didn't have a TV. I didn't have a TV with cable or satellite. I had a television that had one of the VHS players built into the bottom of it, one of those old CRT TVs, maybe 18-inch TV with a little VHS thing at the bottom of it. So I would pop that in and watch that all the time. That way my parents wouldn't get mad that I was staying up until, 10 p.m. to finish watching Raw or whatever. And that way they could also filter what I was seeing, because who knows what they're going to put on Raw that week, especially in the year 2000 when I started watching. So that would be 2000 when I actually have memory of this stuff to probably 2008. I knew nothing aside from WWE.
Okay.
No clue that anything else existed because, one, we were not very wealthy. I won't say we were dirt poor because we got by, but I lived in subsidized housing, and my dad was perpetually taking overtime at his job to try and get us out of that. So living in Mississauga originally, we weren't really going to WWE events, and we didn't really know about any independent events running. I found out later on that there were events running 20 minutes from my house or something like that in Mississauga. Then I moved to Brampton. I don't think Brampton has an indie. At least before I got into wrestling, there was no indie running in Brampton that I knew of. And the closest you'd get is on Canada Day, they would run this thing called Tiger Fest, which was basically Rob Fuego's school, which was Squared Circle Training at the time, would bring in a few of his more polished students, and then a lot of Canadian talent that was not signed to the WWE. So I'm talking TNA talent, former WWE talent who are still active on the indies, which that was my introduction to the indies, was going there and seeing people I had never seen before, but then also seeing Angelina Love, Rhino, Bobby Roode, I'm pretty sure one of the years, a bunch of those people who still lived in Canada would go and do the show during Canada Day in Brampton. So that's how I found out about that. And in that time frame, in between 2008 and 2013, when I first started researching wrestling and independent wrestling, I found out about TNA somewhere in there. I cannot pinpoint the year. All I know is that the first match I saw involved the Rock and Rave connection.
Oh, okay.
That was the first act I ever saw on TNA. That is the main thing I remember from starting watching. Like, I know the Main Event Mafia was a thing when I started watching, and then it just sort of all blurs together after that. Like, my mental timeline of what I experienced when all sort of blurs together.
So this Canada Day show would have been your first like taste of a live wrestling performance, as opposed to just seeing it on television.
Actually, now you say, yeah, I never processed it that way, but that was the first time I ever saw wrestling live at all.
Do you recall any feelings you had about it, or any influence that it might have like generated for you?
It was a lot of surprise and intrigue because I didn't know that happened. Because like I had found out about TNA before I found out about Tiger Fest. I know that much because I recognized Angelina Love and I recognized Bobby Roode, but I had no clue that these things happened outside of like essentially a WWE venue or the Impact Zone. Like, I had no context for WCW, for example, right? I had no context for the Indies. Didn't even know about like wrestling in other countries. Like, I didn't know that much about Japanese wrestling. I didn't know much about Mexican wrestling. I knew they existed because they'd say like, oh, Rey Mysterio, father legendary luchador in Mexico. Or they'd go, sorry, not Rey Mysterio. I think it was Chavo Guerrero and Eddie Guerrero. They would talk more about like the Guerrero family. I knew that there were people who came over to TNA like on excursion, and they would say like, oh, they're over here like from Japan. They're wrestlers from Japan. So I knew nebulously of these things existing, but I couldn't tell you a company name, couldn't tell you, where to watch it. And to be fair, that's still difficult to do. Like, it's still difficult to watch unless you have somebody who's going to like, here you go, here's how you watch it. It's difficult to watch CMLL. It's difficult to watch AAA. It's difficult to watch New Japan unless you already know of their existence and are willing to seek it out. So I had nothing to do with that, and nothing to do with the Indies as well, pretty much for the same reason. The Indies are not well promoted. If you are not somebody who already knows independent professional wrestling, and you are not somebody who walks around the venues and pays attention to advertising. Because, like, in my neighborhood, there has never, and I'd be surprised if there was ever, advertisements for professional wrestling. It doesn't really exist.
Keeping in mind at that era, too, social media hadn't become the thing that it is. So, like, marketing really was word of mouth and, foot to pavement. There really wasn't, the internet to be able to discover everything else. So at this young age, you're kind of grasping at whatever you can, a little bit of WWE on TV, a little bit of whatever you can find on the independents. Is there any particular element of wrestling or any performers that are actually keeping you going and keeping you wanting to discover more about this?
This is a thing that has always bothered me about professional wrestling. I think a lot of people are disingenuous when they talk about who they wanted to be, unless you really make them break it down to like, who did you want to be when you were a child? Because if you go like, what wrestlers did you idolize? They're not going to go to when they first started wrestling, they're not going to go to when they first started watching wrestling. They're going to go to like maybe like 2 years into the business where they thought that they were smart to things and they could give like, some people give like really like hipster answers to this stuff. And you go like, oh, like, who did you want to be like? And they're like, oh, man, I always wanted to be like Masawa. It's like, but shut the fuck up. You didn't know who Masawa was. Who did you want to be before you got into wrestling and found at like, if you knew about New Japan from age 6, then your dad is Meltzer. Like, you did not know about New Japan when you started watching wrestling. Who did you want to be like when you were a kid? If that changes, that changes. Like, when I started watching wrestling, and it hasn't really changed that much, I've always been into to use the SmackDown versus Raw 2008 character types. I've always been into showman style wrestlers. So my favorites, when I was like actually consciously watching wrestling week in, week out, it wasn't my dad had it on and I sort of saw it. John Morrison, Dolph Ziggler, Shawn Michaels, those were like my top three. I wanted to be those guys. They were very showy, whether it was in attire or performance in general. Like Ziggler, I always thought Ziggler had really cool attire. Like he was one of the only people that was really using animal print a lot. Morrison's big fur coat, all the rhinestones and stuff like that. Also, he looked like a superhero because he's always had just like an incredible physique. And then Shawn Michaels, it was the way he carried himself. He carried himself with a sort of, to say larger than life, it's like it's such an overused term, but he carried himself with, if you were to go like, oh, this guy is a Hollywood star, but not in a field that you've heard of. Like he's not a movie guy, he's not a musician, but he's something else, but it's Hollywood. You'd be like, okay, cool, yeah, that makes sense. You look at what he's wearing these big, gaudy costumes, everything, especially if you watch a Shawn Michaels entrance, he had that shit down to a T. Mm-hmm. Like with the pyro, because his pyro was time cued, all that stuff. It was very, very nice. As for me as a kid going, if I want to be a star, these are the people I want to be like.
Yeah, these are people that wanted to make a point that they're a big deal before they even started wrestling. Like right from the second they came out from the curtain, it was a show. Mm. Let's fast forward a little bit. So you're a wrestling fan, you're getting a little bit older. When is it that you kind of have a trigger go off that you're like, I want to actually look into getting myself involved in this industry?
My mom has always been incredibly hesitant with me doing wrestling, as a lot of moms are when their kid gets into wrestling. It's like, I don't want you to get hurt. My mom coming up, I'm pretty sure was like actively watching when Psycho Sid broke his leg. My dad was actively watching when Draws broke his neck, when Austin broke his neck. Like there was so many injuries that happened while my parents were watching wrestling, and some of them like catastrophic injuries. Mm-hmm. So for her thing was, I do not feel comfortable doing this, and if he wants to do it, there's no point in half-assing it, because in her opinion, half-assing it was how you got hurt, which mm-hmm. I also agree with. So it was like, you have to put your own money into this. So I turned 15. Well, I turned 14 and started like umpiring baseball because I played baseball in my childhood.
Okay.
But that makes like next to no money. And I was realizing like the money I was getting, I was like, I can't learn how to wrestle without like a consistent income. How did I have that foresight at 14? I don't know. But I waited until 15 when I actually got like a part-time job. Started working at No Frills. And it was like, all right, I'm getting like 2 shifts, like 2 5-hour shifts a week. It's making me like, I don't know, about $100 a week. And I was like, wrestling training can't be more than $100 a week. So I started looking into wrestling training, and I literally just Googled where to learn wrestling Toronto. And you'd get Mat Men and you'd get like independent clubs and stuff like that. But I had already done that. When I first moved to Brampton, my next door neighbor was a wrestling coach at a local high school. And he very graciously offered, he was like, if you ever want to enroll your kids into something where they're not going to, they'll be occupied after school, they're not going to get into trouble, I'll happily have them, they can learn wrestling. My older brother didn't take him up on it. I did. So I had like 2 years of that. So I knew what to look for to know that's not what I want. Like, I don't want to go to Mat Men. I don't want to go to all these things. And I don't remember what I specifically Googled, but I feel like I might have Googled like WWE wrestling training Toronto or something like that. And I got Squared Circle training, which was Rob Fuego around the Jane and Finch area. The tough part of that is I'm 15 years old. I don't drive. I live in North Brampton, which when taking transit, I think it would have been 2.5 hours to get there. Because like you had to take like 4 different buses to actually get to Jane and Finch. You have to like 3 buses to get out of the Brampton transit system and then another bus through there. So I was like, okay, this sucks. I won't be able to do this. I told my mom about it, and she said, okay, well, we can do what we used to do for baseball, because my younger brother was still playing soccer. So she was like, it wouldn't really be fair if I told one of my kids that like I would drive them to their sport of choice, but not the other. So she drove me like one night a week. Now, mind you, wasn't there for long. One night a week for probably 3 months, because I lose my part-time job because it's seasonal. Don't get another one right away. I'm like, I don't know if I can consistently do this. And also, it's really far. I'm only getting to go once a week. Let's reevaluate and see what we can do. When I was ready to go back, I was 17. And at that point, a lot of the people I previously trained with were starting to post on Facebook about going to Battle Arts in Mississauga. And I was like, oh, well, Mississauga's so much closer. I was like, Mom, what's the difference in drive time between this place at Jane and Finch and this place at Tomkin and Eglinton? She's like, oh, that's like a 20-minute drive. Like, that's so much closer. So I started going there. It also helps. Big selling point. Santino Morello was there, somebody who I'd watched on TV, right? And coincidentally, it was also at the time where, like, I think 4 or 5 months later, Squared closed down. It was shortly after. It wasn't too long after that, by the time that I had started going to Battle Arts, that Squared had closed. So it just worked out nicely that way. And then I started going to Battle Arts for a little bit until I finished high school.
Do you recall kind of some of your first impressions, your feelings heading into training school, whether that was at Squared Circle or Battle Arts?
I feel like the first impression that I had from Squared was that it wasn't what I was expecting, because I had no concept of what independent wrestling really was. And I also had no concept of what wrestling training was really like, because despite watching wrestling, I had never watched Tough Enough, for example. And I actually missed, I think the bulk of when Tough Enough was running, I missed it entirely.
Okay.
Because like the Ruthless Aggression era, I missed almost all of it. Missed the debut of Cena. I feel like I first started watching consistently again was probably WrestleMania 23. Like there's a big gap. But then again, like I said, like a lot of these things, a lot of my timeline blurs together in my head for like what's going on television. I can recall what I was doing pretty clearly, but television is a harder thing to recall. So I remember it not being what I expected out of training, and also not what I expected out of indie wrestling. But that's more so just me being uneducated and not having any context for either.
Was there any element of it that you found that you kind of gravitated to naturally and kind of got the hang of pretty easily? Or was there any particular part that was like overly challenging that you had to overcome?
So doing theater, I wouldn't be tested on this really at Squared. I do not ever recall doing like character work at Squared. It was very fundamentals. It was rolls, bumps, all that stuff. And then going to Battle Arts, though, promos were something I got pretty easily, because theater, and also I had watched a ton of promos specifically. Like I remember there was a time in probably would have been 2013 where this is like the beginning of NXT, like the beginning of Black and Gold era NXT. And they had these presentation skills classes. That's what they called their promo skills classes, I guess. And some of these videos got leaked. And they were on YouTube because WWE like DMCA'd them real quick. But someone had posted about it on Facebook or Twitter or something like that I was on at the time. Maybe it was Reddit. And I ended up finding them on like this Russian version of YouTube, some weird site. But I had watched all of those promos. And then I went, okay, well, this is really interesting. And I went back and like, I would go on Reddit and go to find threads when I Googled them. I'm like, what are the most famous promos of all time? And I would look at those. So coming from theater, those were really easy for me to adapt. And then the other aspect of it was when I started at Squared, bumping was really easy for me, and I feel like it was because I was 15 and didn't really have context for like injury. So I was already like decently, I won't say athletic. I was decently coordinated physically. So if someone went like fall on your back, whatever, you do it however you think is best. And they go, okay, this time do it and leave your feet in the air. And like all the little steps, I didn't have to like retrain my brain. I got all of those little steps. So once I bumped poorly like 7 times with like a little adjustment being made each time, I was pretty fine on the 7th one. And then I would just keep that going forward. I remember being sort of like slightly praised because it was like, do a flip bump. And I had a really good vertical jump. So it was like I got a really high flip bump, but I landed on my ass because like I over rotated. So those things came easier to me than others. Like I found I got those within the first 3 months. I was bumping perfectly fine. Whereas like now I see kids start and then like some of their bumps are still wonky like 6 months to a year in.
Yep.
So those two are probably the things I found came easiest to me.
You're at Battle Arts and you're training now a little bit more regularly. Can you lead us through how you got to your first match?
I am a strong believer in your first match is actually like your first singles match. Okay. Mainly because it's a little bit selfish, but it's also like, what is a match? What are your responsibilities in a match? The responsibilities that are encased in a singles match, even if you're not the one leading it, which you won't be for like, I don't know, however long, the responsibilities in a singles match are astronomical compared to your responsibilities in a battle royal, which for a lot of people is their first time in front of a crowd.
Okay.
So like doing battle royals was sort of the Battle Arts way of we'll do a battle royal every single show. Whoever does not have a singles match or a tag match or whatever, whoever does not have another match on the card, and also some of the people who did have matches in the first half. It was always the first match after intermission so that those people who wrestled in the first half could take a little bit of time to recover and then come back out because they were the more experienced people so that they could help lead the thing. You don't really want the blind leading the blind. If it's a bunch of new students doing a battle royal, everybody's going to die. So they got them back out. That was like my first 5 shows was doing battle royals. And then I started doing tag matches, which a little bit more responsibility, but like not quite. And then you get into singles matches. So I want to say my first singles match, I'd probably trained at Battle Arts for about 7 months. And it was against D-Man Parker. It was an odd case because despite me having less experience, I was the heel in the match. It was being at Battle Arts, it was kind of a hybrid of WWE style and shoot style wrestling, which is like, it's not Battle Arts style, as Santino liked to call it, but he wanted us to integrate more legitimate techniques and maneuvers into everything we did. That was sort of our what differentiated us from other people. That was his mindset with it. So 7 months in of training under Santino, Hornet, who is now a referee in NXT, and then Yuki Ishikawa, who's like the original founder of Battle Arts. They were the 3 coaches for the bulk of my time there before I went to college. I'm trying to think if there was any others in that time. Andrew McCrae, Freedom Wallace, he did a few classes here and there. But leading up to my first match, it was those 3. They're the ones that trained me.
Being such a strong fan of character work, did you kind of always have, at least in the back of your mind, an idea of how you wanted to present yourself as a wrestler?
Yes, but it always changed. It changed. Sometimes it changed because of circumstance where, well, you don't want to do X because it requires a lot. It's not an idea that I had, but to give you an example, There are certain gimmicks that I find, certain presentations that I find you need to have a level of either the machine being behind you or production value. You cannot be Goldberg when you are not being pushed, because if you're always losing, how are you Goldberg? I always gave the example for things that don't work without production value. I gave the example of The Undertaker. Does the Undertaker entrance hit the same when it's WrestleMania, but it's in the daytime? No. Everybody who watched those entrances is like, man, I wish they would have waited and put it on later in the show so it could be nighttime because the better ambiance or whatever. It's like, cool. That is still WrestleMania. Does the Undertaker's entrance work in a high school gym? No, it doesn't. It doesn't evoke the same feeling out of people. It doesn't work the same. So there were certain things that I thought would be good gimmicks, and then you start doing them and it's like, it doesn't really hit the same without some level of production value or extraneous promos to help sell the gimmick. Like the $1 Million Man is great. The $1 Million Man does not work if he doesn't have any mic time or he doesn't have any vignettes showing him being rich. How do you display being rich in the small microcosm of just a wrestling match? Right? So there are previous gimmicks that I had ideas of. One of them did involve like royalty and wealth and stuff like that, and it didn't really work. And then that one sort of just morphed into doing like a tag gimmick that didn't really have any, and it didn't really have anything crazy character-wise in it. And I feel that's because we were also sort of brought up at Battle Arts in the sense of you can figure this stuff out and that's good, but don't get too attached to it, because Santino's whole thing was like, I'm grooming you for WWE. Like, I want you to get to the WWE. They're going to give you something anyway. And that mirrors his experience. You know, if you look up his old OVW stuff, being Boris Alexiev, being this Russian Sambo fighter, he gets to the WWE and there is not even a hint of that. It's completely gone. He's not Russian. He's now Italian, as he is in real life. He's not a Sambo fighter. He's a random guy picked out of the crowd on an Italy show. So his mindset was like, yeah, sure, you can do character stuff, but like, don't get too attached to it. So for me, I took that as like, all right, focus on the wrestling. Focus on the wrestling, focus on getting your life together outside of wrestling, and then worry about the character stuff after. So I didn't get to do any of the real showman stuff until post-COVID, really.
So COVID obviously was an impact on pretty much everybody. How did you navigate the challenges of COVID and the world shutting down, and maybe any sort of momentum that would have been kind of taken away from you when that hit?
I'm incredibly lucky I didn't have any momentum.
Okay.
So there was nothing where I was like, well, not in terms of like I am wrestling and I'm building steam and I'm getting more consistent bookings. It wasn't that. It was more so that the momentum I was about to try and build got kneecapped entirely. So it sucks because it's like, I don't have, like, I've set up all this stuff and it's like, all right, I've basically got all the ingredients for this cake and I've put them all out. And then all of a sudden, like, my oven doesn't work. And it's like, okay, great. I can't do anything with these. I've put all these things into place. I've set up all these things, nothing to do with them. So, like, in terms of, I'd been designing gear since 2018. So it's like designing a bunch of stuff for myself to buy future sets of gear. I had ideas for promos and character work and all this stuff out the window. But also I had planned a trip to Japan to wrestle, because there was a guy that was at Battle Arts who got into the JET program, which is like, essentially you go over to Japan, you teach Japanese kids English. And he was doing that, and he was also doing wrestling as well in Ehime Prefecture in Japan. So with him being there, and then Yuki also going back to Japan while I was in college, I was like, okay, can you guys help me navigate this? They were both on board for it. So I had planned this trip to Japan to go basically live with my buddy Juan, who went over there for the JET program, and then go to Ehime, train there, and then try and with Yuki sort of bridging gaps for me, get to other promotions in Japan. I didn't have like a well-formulated plan, but I had my working holiday visa. I had my flight booked, all of that stuff. World shuts down. So I won't say that it took away specific momentum, but it did reroute me in a way that still benefited me at the end of it. And I think benefited me more than the Japan trip would have, because hindsight being 2020, I didn't have a plan. I probably would have just went there for a few months, lived with Juan, trained in Ehime, maybe wrestled on Ehime Pro, but then it's like pick up 1-2 bookings outside of that and then have to come back because I can't really make money being in Japan. Like, yeah, you can work. It's a working holiday visa, but it's like, did I have a job lined up? No. Could I speak any Japanese? No. So it's like, hindsight 2020, it was a good thing I didn't go.
How did you turn that into a positive? What is that benefit that you were referring to?
So 2 things that I did. So I get the flight money back. And the first thing I do is I go, I'm going to buy gear because this money was set aside for a flight to benefit me in my wrestling career. I shouldn't just take it back and then buy, I don't know, shoes. Like, I should buy something that's going to benefit my wrestling career. So I bought gear. That was the first thing I did. And then while I was waiting for this gear to come in, my thing that I was worried about was I've already lost all this time to college. I've lost 3 years, right, of time that I could have been training, working, and all that, because I could not balance both. I couldn't balance college and wrestling training. So I went, how do I not lose this time entirely? How do I not have who knows how long at this point? Because nobody really had a clue how long COVID was going to last. Like they said, like 2 weeks. Once it gets past 2 weeks and they start going, maybe 2 more, it's like, okay, none of us know. None of us know when this is going to be over. So I just started networking on Twitter. I started following a bunch of people, engaging with their posts. They would follow me back, all this stuff going on. I was just trying to be personable so that people who either already had a following or I enjoyed what they were doing pre-pandemic. I enjoyed their sense of humor, right? A lot of people that like I naturally got along with, I tried my best to network. And then my gear came in and I was incredibly unhappy with it. Like I said, I've been designing since 2018. So after 2.5 years of designing, I want to say I had at least a dozen things that had been made that like I actually got to see, hey, I designed this and the person I designed it for went and bought it, or the stuff that I had bought previously. And every single time I had ever designed something, it had come out pretty damn close to how I had designed it because I was very meticulous with my designs. And I had a lot of experience, obviously, playing the WWE games, putting together gear, finding what color combos I liked. So I had like a little bit of a basis. Design-wise, I had done well so far. The gear that I got back, like the gear that I bought with my flight money, it didn't look like I had designed. It looked vaguely like it, but there were things that I explained that were not followed. And then also there were just like sizing issues, not with the fit of the gear on my body, but one of the logos were just way too large. And I remember going back to the person who made it and going, hey, so these are the issues with this. And they said, okay, I can see that. And I go, how did these issues even come about? Like, I don't know how this happens. And they went, oh, well, the logos are too big. Yeah. You didn't specify how big you wanted the logos. I'm like, no, but like my designs are pretty clear cut. Like if on the design, it looks like it takes up, I don't know, it looks like it's about a quarter of the height of the total tights is the design. And then I get the gear and it's a half of the length of the tights is the logo. And like it wraps around my entire leg as opposed to being this little circle emblem on the side. Clearly, like, could I have told you specific specs? Yeah, but that's not my job. I should not have to give you not only the measurements of my body, but also the measurements of, oh yeah, and the circle logo should be 9 inches tall and 9 inches wide and et cetera, et cetera. And her response was, okay, I can remake it for free, but you're in the back of the line. It's going to take another 3 months.
Oh.
And I was like, that sucks. Because we're getting to the point. This is in mid June that I got the gear. So I go, okay, well, there are whisperings at this point, basically, that we're close to reopening, which means shows are going to run again. I can't wait 3 months for this shit. And frankly, I was just annoyed because I felt I shouldn't have to, because it wasn't my mess up. Like, why do I have to go to the back of the line if I didn't make the mistake? So I went to a woman that I know who sewed, and basically went, "Is this as bad as I think it is?" And she said, "Yes." "How much did you pay for this?" And I was like, I told her I paid for it. She's like, "That is an absurd price." Because, coming from a culture where people don't really get bespoke clothing, doesn't really happen. And if they do, it's not, in the hundreds of American dollars. So she goes, I cannot teach you how to make this stuff. She doesn't make with spandex. But she's like, I'll teach you how to sew. I'll teach you how to use a sewing machine. Which is great, because I got one for my 18th birthday and tried to use it to make like wrist bracers to fit one of my earlier gimmicks, and I could not figure it out for the life of me. My mom is not a sewer. My dad is not a sewer, so I didn't really have any resources to go off of. So basically, learned how to use a machine from her, came home, still pretty knee-deep in lockdown. Like, I think we opened in August for 2 weeks, and then we shut back down again. So I come home, I go with a family friend, because she was over the moon about me learning how to sew, this family friend that I had. She brought me to all these fabric stores to buy a bunch of fabric. And I tore apart old gear of mine and learned how to sew. Being stuck in the house, with the exception of the one show I did in August, being stuck in the house from mid-June to early November, I just made myself like 4 or 5 different sets of gear. I learned how to make tights by tearing apart my old tights. I learned how to make bikers by just shortening that pattern. And I learned how to make trunks and knee pads and kick pads from videos on YouTube that were by Breaknight Creative, and then a Discord ran by Ophidian from Chikara. So Ophidian and his wife, Kate Nix, they run this Discord for gear makers, and that's how I learned a lot of the other skills. But none of that would have happened if COVID never happened and I had just gone to Japan and came back, because I probably would have went, well, that Japan trip sucked. Let's try and get back into wrestling, like in North America.
Now you do it full out as a business, right?
Yeah. So basically November, I say mid-June to November, I was making myself stuff. November, I took like my first paid client, because I was just like, a lot of people because I was posting this stuff on Twitter and Instagram as I was going with the network I had been building at the same time. A lot of people were like, this stuff looks pretty good. Like, is it holding up? And then I'm like, well, I don't know. I haven't really used it because I'm not really wrestling. So, but like, going around the house and shit, it's holding up. I was lucky that I was also able to use COVID money that we got in Canada, like the stimulus checks that we were getting, the CERB stuff. I used that to acquire machines that I learned about that would make like stuff easier. Like, I bought a Cricut, I bought a serger, all that stuff. And then I took my first paid commission in November, which was a member of it was a Nightmare Factory student who ordered stuff from me because he had seen the stuff that I was making on Instagram. And then I had made maybe 5 or 6 more things over the months. And then April 2021, I was just getting really disillusioned. I was working security for the city. I got really disillusioned with it because that was around the time where they said that kids couldn't be on parks anymore. Like, it was Easter weekend. And they were like, we're gonna increase the lockdown, second wave, that time frame. And they didn't want anybody playing basketball and doing social gatherings. And I was like, okay, that makes sense because it's a social thing. But then they were like, nobody using the basketball hoops at all. Doesn't matter if they're alone. And also nobody on like public playgrounds. No using the swings, no using the slides, etc., because cross-contamination of surfaces and all that. And after like 3 days of that, of having to go around because I'm getting called to these things. going around to families and being like, hey, someone called it. I don't know who in your neighborhood hates you, but somebody called in and said that your child was using the playground and it's technically not allowed. And they're probably watching from whatever window they can see this park from, and got annoyed that they couldn't go to the gym and do the things that they like to do. So they have to ruin your fun. I have to tell, these kids to get off the park. Parents yelling at me, kids crying, all that stuff. I was like, this sucks. So I went on to Twitter and I was like, I want to do this full time. I've been making gear. Who wants gear? If there's enough interest, I will start doing this full time. And I got, in the span of 2 days, I got about 20 inquiries for gear where I'm like, okay, cool. At the rate that I make stuff now, this is 2 months worth of work, because I wasn't fast. I wasn't fantastic. I still had every new commission I got was me sitting there for a day going, how in the hell am I supposed to do this? Because it's not my measurements, and it's not if it's a singlet, okay, cool. I never made myself a singlet. I now have to figure out how to make a singlet. I have to figure out how to make a basketball jersey, shorts, all that sort of stuff. The stuff that I hadn't already done for myself. So April 2021 was when I started doing gear full time. And now in October of 2024, I am still doing it full time. I now have an assistant that works with me. I am potentially getting another assistant, and I've made gear for somebody in every major promotion. And I've had gear on every single major promotion. I've had gear in New Japan, AEW, Ring of Honor, TNA, WWE, NXT. I've had gear or gear designs in all of them in the span of 3.5 years.
What was the first big one that you saw on TV, and do you remember how that felt?
Oh, the first big one on TV?
Or even just to a major audience?
I have to think, actually, because I know my first TV client was O'Shea Edwards. This is in the tail end of ROH as its own independent company, as opposed to being under the AEW umbrella. I feel like it was Final Battle. He wore one of the singlets that I made for him on Final Battle. So that was the first time I ever saw anything on TV, and I was like, that was pretty cool. After that, so I make for Speedball. I probably vaguely see it. I've got a framed picture because that is the first time I'd ever made gear for somebody who won a championship on television.
Wow.
That set, there's a blue and gold Raiden inspired set that I made for Speedball, and he won the X Division Championship in an Ultimate X match at Slammiversary 2022. And that was the first time I ever had someone wearing my gear where it's this is not just it's someone on TV. This is somebody who is at the top of the business. They are a champion in a television promotion. So that was really cool. And I think the next one from that would be a really big thing in my brain was I made stuff for Leo Rush that he wore on Wrestle Kingdom, which for me was super big because not only is it the WrestleMania of New Japan, I've also always seen Japanese gear at a higher level than American gear, because if the Japanese are going to do something, especially when it comes to craftsmanship, they're going to do it right. And it's an art-based endeavor. They do not you don't do art and sell art as a hobby. You are going to be good at it, and you're going to do it to the best of your ability. And the best of your ability needs to be really, really good, or else you might as well not bother. If you look at some of the Japanese gear makers, some of it is you can tell sometimes if someone's been to Japan or if someone gets their gear made from a Japanese maker. My example that I always put forward is Takeshita. If you look at a lot of the AEW guys have really, really good gear. A lot of them also have gear from Japanese makers, or they have gear that is based off of the designs and craftsmanship that Japanese makers did for them. But if you look at Takeshita and you watch him go on to an indie, Takeshita's gear just stands out because it's not even one of those things where you go, oh my God, it's such a compelling design that it couldn't be made by anybody else. It probably could, but the way that it's done is just at an incredibly high level, and it is very aesthetically pleasing. And that's just him as an example. It's not even to talk about people like Ibushi, who I've always thought his gear looked great. Kenny's gear looks great. The House of Black, they get their gear made mostly by a Japanese maker named Soi Takeda. Their gear is always fantastic. Japanese gear is so good. So for my gear to be on the biggest Japanese show of the year and not look out of place was a big accomplishment for me.
That's amazing. So the last thing I want to ask you about is just the creation of Dynasty and how you recall that and what part you had to play in that.
I played a non-existent part in the creation. I showed up to a show one day at Battle Arts, and at the time, Nick, Flatliner, Asylum, Stone Rockwell, whatever name you know him by, he was coaching the program and he was putting together these shows. And I walked in. I don't even remember if I was like scheduled to be there. I think I just knew the show was going on, and like I showed up because it was my home gym. And Nick kind of came up to me. He's like, "Do you want to like do a stable?" I was like, "Okay, what? Like, do I have any more context on this?" He was like, "Yeah." So Mikey and Jackson, who I had met the both of them, I liked the both of them. I didn't know as much about Jackson. I'd seen Mikey more because I think Mikey started coming to classes earlier, but I always liked Mikey's energy and his like mindset about learning stuff in wrestling. He was always willing to try something, and he was like, "Oh, well, I think I can do this." And it's like, "Okay, well, like, are you sure?" He's like, "Yeah, let me try it." Like, that was always how he went about things. So as soon as they put those two names for it, I was like, "Of course, no problem. What do you want us to do?" You know? And that's why I said I have no part in the formation of it, because I just kind of got chucked in. It like, they had put my name forward to be a member of it, like when they were pitching it to Nick, I guess. But I heard about it the day I stepped into the building. And now it has become like I'll admit, it's become bigger than I thought it was going to be. Because I didn't even know that it was going to be like an outside of Battle Arts thing. I thought it was just because most of my career up until that point was spent in Battle Arts and at Junction, which was 80% Battle Arts people wrestling in a promotion that wasn't in Battle Arts. It was run by a Battle Arts guy, right? Like, so I didn't know how far it was going to go. I didn't think it was going to go super far, not because I doubted them, but just because I had never had anything go that far, to the point where now, like, being Destiny Tag Team Champions, being as a unit on C4, if you had told me when we started Dynasty that was going to be in the cards of it, like, I wasn't getting booked on Destiny prior to the pandemic for the 5 years or whatever it was running prior to the pandemic, 5-6 years. I wasn't booked on it. I had helped out on a lot of the shows, but I'd never wrestled on it. So telling me when Dynasty starts, yeah, in like a year and a half, you guys will be tag champs at Destiny. I wouldn't have known this. I wouldn't have believed you, because it's like, oh, well, I'll believe it when I see it. But I do have to give a lot of the credit to Mikey and Jackson for doing so much legwork in it, whether that is going to promotions, networking in their own way. Like, I network in some ways, but they network in a completely different way than I do, and it works. Like, both of our ways work. Credit to Derek as well. Derek is, I rib him all the time. I go, "You're limited by the fact that you don't have a car." Because if he was able to go and network independently the way that Mikey and Jackson do, or even if he, like, I'm not going to tell him to move, but it's like if he lived closer to us and we could carpool easier, I feel like people would understand his potential as well. I feel like that gets underlooked sometimes, but like, kudos to him, because he still works at it. He doesn't go like, whatever, I'm just going to sit at home and sulk. Like, no, he still actively works. He still actively trains. The same way that I made my own path, the same way that Mikey and Jackson made their own path, he is also making his own path. So I had nothing to do with the formation of it, but I'm very happy that I was included very early on and that it has become what it has become now.
Okay, so just quick, I call it rapid fire, but
sure.
Okay, your favorite or most memorable moment as a part of Dynasty up until this point in your career?
Oh man, there was a point. I have a picture of it somewhere in my computer. It was when we jumped Karoo. Like straight up, that is one of the most memorable moments to me because there's this fantastic photo because Mikey and Jackson have just done whatever, and I am like, the photo was captured literally in the midst of me like punching Carew like while he's on the ground. And for me, growing up watching stables, if you could jump somebody effectively, you were probably pretty good. Nexus jump people effectively. I don't care what anybody says. I love Nexus. The Shield jump people effectively all the time. The Wyatt family jump people effectively all the time. So in my later years of watching wrestling, if you could jump somebody, you were doing pretty good. I think we did pretty good. That just sticks out in my brain as one of the most memorable moments.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for doing this. Before we sign out, can you please just remind everybody who you are and maybe where they can follow you online?
I'm Sway Archer, also known as the Culture King, a representing member of Dynasty, and one, not third, but part, because we all hold them equally, one part of the Destiny Tag Team Champions. So you can find me everywhere at Sway Archer. SWAYARCHER. It's the same handle on literally every social media platform. And if I'm not on there, then the platform probably sucks.
Thank you for tuning in to Independent Wrestling Profiles. Please help out the show if you can with a like, subscription, or review. We'll see you next time.